The black community is suffering and does not have that. And they have predatory businesses in their community. And when you come to this country, you're conditioned to kind of see each other through the lens of, oh, this is what I heard about them. They don't work that hard. They're not this, they're not that. And y nosotros hacemos los trabajos que ni los negros hacen, and all that negative kind of talk.
So something that I saw on Facebook the other day that was shared by many of my family members and just folks that I know, and I didn't know at the time how to just confront them about it, but there was a video and it said, the caption of it, and then in big letters across the screen it said, Latino lives matter too. And so the entire video was just instances where mainly Black folks were committing acts of violence against Latinos. And so it was like a Latino man who was like a paletero, and he was being robbed by two young Black men. And it was just like, it was extremely, extremely anti-Black. And I was like, why are y'all sharing this? Like, what, you know, and they feel as though they have to take themselves away from, you know, this movement, Black Lives Matter.
Hello everyone, welcome back to Historical Africa. Today we are diving into a real, raw, and necessary conversation. Latinos admit Black people are suffering in America. This is not just a headline. It is a moment of truth, and it is time we talk about what that admission really means for communities of color, for allyship, and for justice. Watch and pay attention, and I will share my thought later.
Just real quick, there are many reasons that Blacks and Latinos are intricately linked. However, there are also culprit in systems of Black oppression. Despite our proximity to Black people and the Afro-Latinos in our families, internalized and you know, the racism runs deep in the Latino community. Anti-Blackness is ingrained in our community, and it's also something that is often swept under the rug. We have a long way to break down hundreds of years of white supremacy, but as Latinos, refuse to be active in the Black liberation movement is to deny ourselves as Latinos as an ally that is necessary but not mandatory in the fight for our collective freedom for immigration reform and community justice. So with that, if you guys want to start off, just, you know, kind of letting us know how you feel as though why there's such a disconnect between Blacks and Latinos. If anyone had any personal stories or situations that may have occurred in which, you know, you felt like you had to defend, obviously, your friends of color in situations, and may even feel uncomfortable at the same time because it's like, hey, it's not even really my fight. So why, you know, why bother, you know?
Yeah, I can
get involved.
Yeah, I can kind of start. So something that I saw on Facebook the other day that was shared by many of my family members and just folks that I know, and I didn't know at the time how to just confront them about it, but there was a video and it said, the caption of it, and then in big letters across the screen it said, Latino lives matter too. And so the entire video was just instances where mainly Black folks were committing acts of violence against Latinos. And so it was like a Latino man who was like a paletero, and he was being robbed by two young Black men. And it was just like, it was extremely, extremely anti-Black. And I was like, why are y'all sharing this? Like, what, you know, and they feel as though they have to take themselves away from, you know, this movement, Black Lives Matter, and saying that, you know, they feel as though we are not highlighting that Latino lives matter, which completely takes out Afro-Latinos from the equation too. And so there's that binary that you create, that there's Latinos and there's Black folks. And then where is the, you know, where are Afro-Latinos in the mix? But also it was, you know, saying that, trying to make a point by showing a video where you're trying to portray Black folks as violent against Latinos was extremely racist and extremely anti-Black. And so I'm just trying to, have conversations with my family, like, that is not, this movement does not mean that your life is not important, or, Latinos are not experiencing violence, but you trying to say that Black folks are violent against Latinos and that this movement is, I guess, inherently violent in a way, is extremely anti-Black. And so I think that, being someone who is Chicana, there's a huge history there with folks who try to create as close of a proximity to whiteness as possible. And so, a lot of us, a lot of Chicanos, we have, I just read something where, the term like Viva la raza and la raza is very, very anti-Black. That was like a very kind of like almost a white supremacist undertone to that term when you say like the raza is more close to whiteness than Black, right? Like you want to keep your raza as like brown people, right? And like mestizaje and people who are more brown than Black, right? And so it was really interesting reading all of that and trying to unpack that in my own identity. But for me, I think anti-Blackness personally shows up when a lot of my family, when there's trying to talk about how we are closer to brown and white, and being anti-Black against Black folks because we have a long history here, right? So like African, talking about Black folks and saying racist stuff about Black folks and trying to separate yourselves from Black folks. I've heard that my whole life, and saying that really, really anti-Black things amongst each other, and not ever wanting to own up that that is racist and anti-Black. So I guess for me, that kind of like I didn't know how to confront that, growing up. It was just something where you're like, oh, okay, my family is really, they don't like Black folks. So, but as you learn about the history, it's kind of like, you have to be able to confront that and say, well, how can I talk about anti-Blackness with them, right? So for me, it starts with my own family and people who are close to me, I guess. My long-winded answer.
That's awesome. No, you actually brought up a lot of things, and a lot of things you were saying. I didn't want to interrupt you, but would you say then that, like, in Latino household or even in the Latino culture, that racism just is there?
Yeah, and David, definitely go ahead. But
Well, I think it's important to recognize that the foundation of this, I would say the meeting of the indigenous people of this hemisphere and the kidnap of Africans from the African continent with Caucasian people, it started with the foundational idea being white supremacy. And it's at the root of every system. And, I know that we're talking about it being present in our families, but if it was present in our families, that's because our families were indoctrinated with it. And when you look at how we got to become Latino to begin with, Latino is not necessarily a term that elevates our indigenous ancestry or our African ancestry. It actually practices a form of erasure of it under the guise of Latinidad, that because we speak Spanish, we have a pan-Latino identity, where you and I all have a different experience, maybe in our different countries, or we have a different experience based on our skin tone. I think it's important for us to know that there's a narrative being advanced that Latinos are somehow more anti-Black than other ethnic groups, and that there's a great deal of tension because there's something inherent in our culture. But what's inherent is not our culture. What's inherent is that white supremacy is our experience in this hemisphere as well. And so it was illegal to affirm Blackness. And social mobility in a society, meaning your ability to advance economically, culturally, who you can marry, if you can own land, even down to religion, it really starts there, because in the Catholic Church, Black people, Africans, were not considered as worthy of salvation. But the indigenous people, they were kind of like a question mark. And so they allowed them to be converted into Christianity, but the grade of their social mobility was based upon how much white blood they had. So if we have terms like mejorar la raza, to improve the race, or even down to who can own land and things like that, that becomes ingrained in how we treat each other and how we teach our children. And even down to the most minute thing. How many of us have heard, because colorism is big for us, no tardas mucho para que no oscures, pelo malo and all this other stuff. And even my color, I was taught from a very early age, I was raised knowing that Black Lives Matter and that the blackness in me mattered. And my father and mother both taught me that history. But in the Caribbean, you hear that same language, pelo malo, words like prieto, the form of expression when someone uses the word negro is like the insult is the word negro, and then the word that describes it comes after it. Este negro de mala sangre,
Maldito negro.
All types of terminology that ascribes a negative aspect to Blackness. And most of that came about because of the need for social control of the indigenous people and the enslaved Africans in this continent. But, when you look at our history, see, the most important thing, if I could say tonight, that I want to get across, is that the basis of Black and brown unity is not political. So while we're fighting for Black Lives Matter, when we're fighting for immigrant rights, if we're allowing the electoral cycle to be what forces us to get up and do something about it, then we've already missed the boat. It's not a 4-year, 2-year type thing. We are family of each other as the indigenous people, as the Aboriginal people of the earth. And we had to be taught something to make us hate each other so that we could be controlled by the same enemy. And the same thing is happening today. And for our family that's from Texas, when we look at the Texas history, the Alamo was a war over whiteness. It was a war over the expansion of slave territories because Black people sought refuge in Mexico and were able to escape there. When you even look at some of the history of our quote unquote civil rights organizations, LULAC's first victory in school desegregation wasn't so that brown children could be accepted in schools. It was so that brown children could be classified as white, so that they wouldn't fall under the same the segregation laws that affected Black people. So we have to own up to the fact that we have been indoctrinated and accepted the idea that closeness or proximity to whiteness is closeness to God. Right. And that closeness to Black people is like even down to the terms un salto atrás, like un atraso, like we're taking steps backwards. So when we come into the American dynamic, we fall in line with their stereotypes about Black people. And the last point I'm gonna make on this is like this. In America, if you got 1 drop of Black, you're considered Black. In Latin America, if you have 1 drop of white, you're considered not Black or not Indian. And so whiteness in Latin America allowed us to deceive ourselves and think we were closer to our oppressor rather than close to each other. And this is the generation that ends all of that.
Yeah, let me jump in on that to give maybe like a real life example that'll that's kind of close to us. So I'll just share like what my ancestry is to kind of help contextualize. My mother is second generation Puerto Rican, born and raised in Milwaukee, so is my stepdad. But my biological father is Jewish, from New York. And if you see me, I could look like anything. You don't really know what I am, but my mother's my mother's father, physically, like I've seen a picture of him, he looks like Dave, right? So, brown skin, like clearly not white, clearly some African features. And, the story I always heard from my grandmother is that, he came from another town. to Utuado, and Utuado's a city right in the middle of the island. It's sort of usually seen like phenotypically as a white, like where more white Puerto Ricans live. His name was Juan. So Juan married his wife, who was of sort of Spanish ancestry, looked very white, had 13 children, including my grandfather. Juan made sure that none of his daughters ever brought home anybody that was dark-skinned. My grandfather had the same rule when he moved to Milwaukee for his 2 daughters. If you bring somebody home that's black, you're excommunicated from this family. My mother's mother was an orphan. She was orphaned when she was really young. And her father was also somebody that was more brown skinned than other folks in the town. When the other kids found out that my grandmother, that was her biological father, they used to make fun of her. Oh, eso es tu papá el negro. And it made her, like, it traumatized her. So on both sides of my mother's lineage, like, they were trained and indoctrinated to hate that part of themselves. That's not like an atypical story. Like, that happens all the time. And I mean, I'm just jumping back on Dave's point. It's colonialism. It's you know, psychologically damaging you to so much extent that carries along for generations and generations and generations.
But how do we stop that? Like, how do we, if we now know that this is what's happening and what's happened to us and what we're experiencing and what we're suffering from, then, you know, how is it that we break away from that, from these generational curses and oppression, or can we? Or is it just ingrained in our culture, in our brains, in our identities?
So, I mean, for me, it's 2 things. Like, one, it's like knowing those stories and understanding them and understanding why they happen and being able to tie them back to the sort of broader history that David was talking about. Like, when I actually met Dave when I was a freshman in college, and we both, you know, pledged a historically African-American fraternity. And, you know, Dave was the one that really sort of like led me to a lot of that knowledge and a lot of that history. A lot of it I read for myself. I, you know, learned about the history of Puerto Rico. I learned about how women were sterilized, especially Black Puerto Rican women. I learned about, you know, the history of Puerto Rico being a colony of the United States. And then I started to tie that back into those family stories and started to dig deeper and dig deeper and dig deeper. The other thing that I had to do is just realize, like, I've got certain privileges because of my complexion, and I can't run away from that. Right. But I also have to, at every step of the way, have those critical conversations with people who maybe share the same culture as me, to be able to say, like, look, this is the truth. Like, this is why this happens. I can be kind and gentle often. I can also be fierce on occasion, but like, it's sort of bringing folks along and constantly exploring, and also exploring like who I am, like knowing that I've always got like stuff I got to work on too, and unlearning all of that stuff. And I mean, I think the other piece is like when you're in rooms where there's power, like saying something, no matter how uncomfortable that is going to be, no matter how much risk you might put yourself at, no matter how much you might lose out on some resources by saying it, like if you get into situations where you gain power to be able to like move things in the room, like you better move things and don't be scared because you want to like maintain a certain relationship. I mean, you can do it gently, you can do it subtly, you can finesse it, but at the same time, you got to be truthful and you always got to speak truth.
But yeah, I think for me, it's like, I'm really tired of being told that I have to say things subtly and gently, you know, but it's also because, you know, I was told the other day that, you know, I was like, bro, really? Like, somebody told me the other day that if there's ever a Latino leader, or if there's ever someone who's in an elected capacity that's Latino, you're never supposed to publicly speak out against them. It doesn't matter what they say or what their bad policy is, or, you know, anti-Black, you know, sentiments. It doesn't matter, because I am Latino and they are Latino. That means that we have to support each other in order to move our agenda, you know, like the whatever that means, forward, and you know, in order to move Latinos forward. And I think that is, am I allowed to swear on here? I'm sorry if there's kids watching, but that's bullshit. You know, like I have always been told that my whole life, that you have to, you know, move quietly. You can't speak out. You have, you know, there's a certain way to do things. And I think that, you know, for me, someone who's just like young, trying to come up, trying to be in an elected capacity one day, I don't want to be silenced anymore. And, you know, and I'm going to use a lot of my voice and energy towards supporting Black folks. And that's just how it goes. And so I think it's really, I don't know, I thought that was the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard in my life. I don't even know what that means, right? So anyway, yeah.
No, I totally feel you, girl. I totally feel you on that. And I think that for me personally, it was when I was, I don't want to say I was like the ratchet, but, you know, it's when I speak the truth, you know, because when Facebook asks me what's on my mind, I want to say what's on my mind. You know what I mean? I'm not going to, like, you know, sugarcoat anything, because it is what I feel and what I think, you know, and people definitely will come at you and sideways like, oh, why you say that? You shouldn't do that. You shouldn't say this because of this or that and the other. And I just say, boo. I'm like, I'm going to do what I have to do and say what I have to do in order to, you know, uplift the human race, really, you know, because I don't want oppression or any racism with any race, you know what I mean? And it's funny because a lot of people then, if they see that you're very pro-Black and just, you know, for the Black Lives Matter, that you are just that and not for anyone else, you know what I mean?
Well, Madi, earlier you asked a question that I think is relevant. You know, we know the root of this, but what is the cure to it? What's the antidote? And I would say for me, it was the knowledge of self. The knowledge of self is, you know, from the historical context. And then, you know,
when you say that, people.
Go ahead. What's that?
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No.
You started cut off.
Because that's the big.
Oh, my bad.
Sorry.
No. I'm working with the technology too. The knowledge of self represents not only my history, but my connection to the Creator. And I do believe that as the original people of the planet, as Black and Indigenous people, we have that, regardless of our mixture, that has happened from our experience, that we're in a unique position because we represent a multinational people, and we represent people with different roots that go to the origin of who we are as humanity. I think it's important to say and acknowledge, for Latinos to acknowledge that you know, all of our ancestry does trace back to those people, to Africa, as well as to our indigenous roots. And so for me, knowledge of self started with studying my history, studying the Black history of Puerto Rico, which is where my family is from, studying the history of Mexico, because I grew up mostly around Mexicans. And so what I saw in there, I learned about people like Emiliano Zapata. I learned about, you know, the history of the Mexican people, as well as the indigenous people of Latin America. But it wouldn't have been, I wouldn't have looked into that had I not learned the history of my people, primarily from the inspiration of myself. Personally, it was the teachings of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad and Minister Farrakhan that got me on that route. And so many of us know the history of Malcolm X and how Malcolm X dropped that last name that was his slave master's name. Well, I wasn't born David Muhammad. Muhammad was the name given to me by my teacher, Minister Farrakhan, the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan. And it represented the body of knowledge of history, of cultural identity, of scripture, of those types of things. But deeper than that, it allowed me to learn, since I learned about myself, it allowed me to learn about other people. And so I came to the table as an equal, not as an inferior. It allowed me to exchange ideas with people who disagreed with me, with people who had different viewpoints. It allowed me to interact in a society that I knew was opposed to me, but I had something on the inside of me that made me to know that I had potential and could accomplish and overcome the barriers and the obstacles of this world. And it showed me that excellence would allow me to overcome the stereotypes that were placed upon me, not by assimilating, not by code switching, not by taming my speech, but by making my point unafraid and fearless, like Megan was talking about. And I think when we shed that fear, you know, some of us, we're conditioned to not make eye contact with figures of authority. And, you know, that was the way I was raised. It was like, you know, no me mires en los ojos when, you know, cuando te están regañando, you know what I'm saying? And so we find ourselves in positions of authority, sitting at tables with people like Joe was talking about, where we have to speak truth to power because we have an entire community of people depending on it. And it's when you have that kind of knowledge, you know that you can't betray your ancestors. And when you move forward like that, it's because you have knowledge of your history and it allows you to make a path for your future.
Absolutely. But then, so what do you say to someone who, you know, okay, you say that we need to educate ourselves, but what do you say to someone who is obviously an older generation or and may have had a bad experience with, you know, a fellow Black person?
Well, you know, and I've heard that too. Is like, you know, cuando se preocupan los negros para nosotros, you know, you hear that kind of talk, right? Y cuando se acordaban de nosotros, I'll put it like this. When you function in your own self-interest, you respect people who function in their own self-interest. And in Milwaukee, for example, there's a great deal, I would say, of political power that the Black community holds that the Latino community doesn't. I'm not saying that they exercise it, but I'm saying that they have it in ways that Latinos don't. Latinos have economic power in this city. There's one, just Cesar Chavez Drive, you got 97 million, I think, around that's generated on that street. The Black community is suffering and does not have that. And they have predatory businesses in their community. And when you come to this country, you're conditioned to kind of see each other through the lens of, oh, this is what I heard about them. They don't work that hard. They're not this, they're not that. And y nosotros hacemos los trabajos que ni los negros hacen, and all that negative kind of talk. A lot of that is social. How do you confront it? You have to confront it with the truth. And to be quite honest, there's a certain generation that is not worth the effort. Straight up. It's really on the young people. And it's on the elders with that kind of knowledge to empower them and to support them and lift them up. And I would say to anybody, young or old, that we have to decolonize. And we have to really undo the mental slavery that most of us are poisoned by, which has us looking at each other through the eyes of our enemy rather than through the eyes of our creator.
For generations, Black Americans have faced systemic racism, from slavery and Jim Crow laws to mass incarceration and police brutality. These are not distant memories, they are current realities. And now, more Latinos are publicly acknowledging this suffering. In a recent wave of social commentary, forums, and street interviews, we are seeing more and more Latinos brothers and sisters saying, yes, Black people are being oppressed in this country. We see it. And that acknowledgement, it matters. From Afro-Latino communities to non-Black Latinos, there is a growing voice saying, we will not stay silent. We recognize the pain and we stand in solidarity. But let's be honest, that was not always the case. There have been cultural divides, colorism, anti-Blackness within Latin communities. Yet, despite those challenges, many are now choosing empathy over ignorance. So why is this shift happening now? It could be the undeniable proof, videos, data, lived experience. It could be the younger generation refusing to inherit silence. Or maybe, just maybe, it is because oppression affects all marginalized people. And when one of us is hurting, all of us should care. This is about building bridges, not walls. About understanding that solidarity does not mean comparison. It means standing with, not speaking over. To my Latino audience, thank you to those who have spoken up, to those still learning, keep going. And to everyone watching, remember this. Acknowledging someone's pain is not weakness, it is humanity. Unity starts with truth. Solidarity starts with listening. Thank you for watching, guys. Don't forget to like this video and share your thoughts in the comment box below. Until next time, cheers and have a good one.